So thanks everyone again for joining us today. We're going to do a talk on governance models, and Matt Murphy from WERU is going to kick us off. And I think this would be probably a topic that we could revisit if there's anyone else who's inspired to share their policies. So we'll just leave the door open on that. And then with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.
All right. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this. First, I'm not going to talk for a long time so we can get conversation going. But first, my kind of disclaimer is I'm not an organizational consultant or a lawyer, but I have been doing this at WERU for over 20 years, and I'm on a bunch of little groups of executive directors of other types of nonprofits in the area. And so I've heard I have all my bad experience, and I've heard all theirs, and I have my good experience, and I've heard a lot of theirs too. So this talking about board governance and staff, board governance and staff management is a universally hot topic, I think. Never goes out of style. I'll talk about our system, and Stephanie, can I share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me see what happens. All right, you can see our logo there. Okay. Yep. This is a governance snapshot that we give to all of our board members and prospective board members, and anyone else who needs to learn a little bit or wants to learn a little bit about how we do governance at WERU. Elements of this may be useful to smaller stations. We're a medium-sized station, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but not saying one size fits all for sure. And this is one that's evolved for us over a long period of time. We've been on the air for 33 years now, and there's certainly been an evolution in our governance. So the board of directors, I'll let anyone who wants to read that go ahead and read it. But the key thing, there's this document that's tossed around a lot, the 10 responsibilities of the board of directors. Well, in our little handout for prospective board members, we have the 6 that we really want to stress. And these are all things that a person on your board needs to do and needs to be able to do in order to be effective at governance and in order to be helping the station. And so these are the ones that we require: attend meetings consistently, be prepared, serve on a committee or special project, ad hoc task force, work in development in one way or another, whether it's friend-raising or fundraising or a combination of the two, but work with our staff and development committee to do some part in development as a board member. Lines of authority, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes, but respect and maintain lines of authority. And this one, number 5, is I've been to workshops, 2-hour workshops on oversight and planning. So there's what it boiled down to one sentence, that in terms of the board's role is to make sure everything's working right, but not in the great details, getting reported on to how things are going and the big picture, and also planning the big picture. So keeping an eye on the big picture and then planning for what the big picture hopefully is going to be down the road, but not getting into the smallest details. And I'll talk about micromanaging a little bit later. And then serve as an ambassador of the station. I think that's a great thing that board members could do. Is just, we have one who almost everyone he talks to walks away with a bumper sticker. He teaches at a crafts school, and he comes and he buys T-shirts for students from all over the country and the world. And so everyone who crosses his path knows about WERU. This little lines of authority diagram, I'll call up a better one. This is one that I just put into this document, but here's a better one. And it makes the delineation between governance and management. And governance is what your board chair and the board does. and management is what your executive director or general manager and the staff do. And so you've got committees on the governance side, you've got the board chair, you've got committee chairs, board of directors, committee members on committees with other volunteers, and staff members serving as resources to the board, as people who can get things done and answer questions and provide resources. On the management side, executive director or general manager, and there's a whole, you can go to buy books on the relationship between the executive director and the board chair. There's an awful lot on that. If you were to go to some place like your state association of nonprofits or board source, like I've seen books and books and books on that relationship. And I'm lucky right now, I have a great board president. We work really well together. And I know for everyone in every organization, that's not always the case. So I thank my lucky stars for that. So under the executive director, you have staff, you have unpaid staff or volunteers doing everything from on air to behind the scenes to committee work. And this is a tricky one, board members working as programming volunteers. The nightmare scenario that I've heard many times is a board member who's a programmer who thinks that they, when they're on the air, they're a board member, so they can do whatever they want, and the rules don't really apply to them. And I see a couple nodding heads. I mean, it happens. Not all board members who are on the air do this for sure, but every once in a while, and when they do, it's a real pain. So that's and I think I gave this document and the other one to you, Stephanie, to put in your archive or in the safe.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So here's the organizational structure at WERU. Board of directors, and we have a maximum of 13 seats on the board. Right now, we have 9 of them filled. And we've got 2 people in the recruiting pipeline that we're hoping to have on in January. We've got an executive committee, which also serves as the personnel committee, and that's the board officers, basically. And when there's a personnel project going on, like right now, our personnel committee is looking at compensation and looking at job descriptions. And so the board president invites other people, if they'd like to be part of that, to come on to that committee temporarily. But so we have an executive committee, we have a development committee, finance committee, and a program advisory committee, and then ad hoc committees for events, for initiatives. So for instance, we have an effort to get younger people involved at the station so that when we have an all station meeting, everyone doesn't have gray hair. We call that Next Wave. And there's a group working on that. They don't have a standing committee yet because nobody really wants to be on a standing committee about that. But there's a group of people working together, and we have one of our board members who's on the younger side, working with that group, as well as working with a staff person who is of a younger age as well. And then they get me kicking around like Uncle Matt. So that's our committee structure. Our staff, again, we're kind of a medium station. To some of you, we may be a large station. To others, we're a little teeny station. We have a general manager, development director, program and ops manager, news and public affairs manager, finance manager, a part-time music director, a part-time underwriting manager, business support manager, office and volunteer coordinator. Then we have some tech contractors, our studio and broadcast engineer, our IT is our contractors with us, and then interns. We just got done with an intern working on 2 projects, and interns are always great to have. And this last one we had was a superstar. I'm in mourning that I'm grieving that she's done with her internship because she was so great. And then volunteers on air, programmers and producers, behind the scenes volunteers, and then board members and committee members. And then like Most of you, or many of you, we have a community advisory board. I kind of think of them as a standing focus group or super listeners who are charged with giving us feedback. And then the little guidelines we like to say, like to tell everyone who's new, thinking about or coming onto the board, as these are things we try to do: having clear policies and procedures and enforcing them, and having a clear decision-making process and then using it, and then maintaining those lines of authority and the chain of command. And that speaks to, you mentioned Ursula or Stephanie mentioned triangulation. And these points are made for trying to avoid, they're not, we didn't think triangulation when we put together these things, but I think if you're doing these three things well, you can help avoid that triangulation, which is so counterproductive. Does anybody have any questions on any of what I've said or shown so far?
I saw Davine had one in the chat about what was the annual budget?
Yeah, the
our annual budget is $500,000.
Okay.
Matt, where does the chief of operations fit into this structure of authority?
Basically, it's kind of a flat pyramid with the general manager up at the top. I think in terms of de facto program and ops manager and development director are kind of like the two, right and left arm of the general manager. And then
so is the operations manager also the chief of operations? Is that?
Yes.
So the chief of operations is a staff position, not a board.
It's a staff position, yes. Yeah. It's combining the program director. Our program director has always been the main interface with engineers. And so we wound up calling it program and ops manager together. We combined, some places have a program director that's all just one position, program and music and public affairs. We have our program director doing a lot of studio ops and working with the cell phone companies whenever they're climbing on the tower, working with our engineers, those kind of things. So it's kind of a hybrid position.
So the operations manager is also chief of operations?
Yeah.
Hey, Matt, could you talk a little bit about how the board selection process works over at WERU? How are new members added to the board?
Yeah, well, our board is...
Matt, before you get in, can I just ask one more question about that? Is the chief, so the chief of operations, he's below the manager?
Yeah. Yeah, he reports to me.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to get that clear.
Yeah. Our board is, board members are elected to the board by the board itself, by other board members. And so the process would be the board president and the personnel committee particularly brainstorm and ask me to be part of that as well. And the president and I have our radar up all the time for what our needs are. And then is there anyone out there either who's already part of the organization or somebody who's out there that we know of who would be, who has what we need. Has what we want. Oftentimes, we don't have that many people come to us and say, I'd like to be on the board. We've had a few, and we asked them to serve on a committee for a year first so that we can get to know them and they can get to know us. And so we have people coming to the board who are on committees, and we have some people who are on committees and on the air, and some people who are just programmers who have become very trusted volunteers at the station and have expressed through all station meetings, through a variety of ways, have made themselves known to myself or other board members or staff as being someone who's really interested in the big picture beyond just doing their show, and then having some aptitude and commitment and love for the station that translates well to the board. So for someone to be on the board, when they start, either the president or I will, the president will ask either me or another board member to reach out to someone. and sit down, and once they're reached out to and they say, oh, I might be interested, or I'd like to learn more, they have a one-on-one meeting with me and then a one-on-one meeting with our president. So they get both kind of the governance perspective and the management perspective that I showed in the lines of authority. Sometimes they meet with us both at the same time. It all kind of depends on people's schedules, and we can do it on Zoom, of course, all three of us at the same time, much easier. Then a person is asked to come to a couple board meetings and observe. Once they have observed and they feel comfortable and we feel comfortable with them, they're nominated, and then they write up a bio that goes in our volunteer newsletter that just is an in-house newsletter, and telling people, here, the volunteers don't get to vote on who's on the board, but if somebody, we want them to know who the board is voting on. And if somebody did have some big question about someone running for the board, there's a month for them to come to the board president or come to me, if there's some really horrendous thing that we need to know about, or if someone just wants to call in and voice support, saying, hey, I'm psyched that so-and-so is going to be on the board. And that's generally what happens more than anything else. And then they're nominated at one meeting, and then the next meeting or a meeting after that, elected to the board. So, and then we let them hang out for a while, not having to be on a committee if they're not already on one, to get their feet wet. And then the board president assigns them to a committee or a project.
I see we had a question from Marie, and then Sharon also had her hand up. Marie says, did you say you have 13 on the board of directors? Have you ever had fewer? How has this worked out?
Yeah, we have 9 right now. And hopefully by January or February we'll have 11, and then one more that we'll try to fill too. We've been down as low as 5, and that was like kind of disastrous. That was really risky, and it was it happened because one board member had a baby and had to take time away, and then somebody else moved, and it all just kind of came down to suddenly we find ourselves with 5 board members, so we really had to put a real big amount of effort into getting more people, and we were, it took us about a year to get up to 8, and now we're at 9, and we've been at 9 for about 3 years, and it's time to step it up more. And we're really in the process right now that the 2 new board members and coming on board are younger people under 30. So that's really important, really super important for us. And I'm pretty psyched about that. So
Bear's asking if there are term limits for board members.
Yeah, but they're really long. Each term is 3 years, but then the board can elect you for another 3 years. And then the board can elect you for another 3 years. So you can be on for 9 years, and then you have to take a year off. And if you want to be back on and the board wants to elect you on after that year, they can do that. And we have a few people who continue on, but most people after, 6 to 9 years of, cry uncle, and it's time to take a break. So, yeah.
Do you want to go next, Sharon?
Is there another question?
I'm muted.
Yeah. Hi, this is Jude again. Matt, could you say some more about what happened when you had only 5 members, and why 8 was better, and why you think 9 or 11 would be better than that? Because I have a sense getting more personalities, more complications getting meetings together for 11 people's schedules, but talk about that somewhat.
Well, when it was down to 5, it was 5 people, 4 of them retired white guys, and 1 a woman who was a social worker and still working. And so she didn't have as much time as retired people have. However, or at least have more control over where they put their time is from what I've been told by retired friends. and there wasn't much diversity on the board, and there weren't enough people to do the work. So, so we really made a real push to have our rural Maine is not a particularly diverse place, and we're in the oldest state in the country per capita. But we really wanted to get gender diversity and going, and we were able to do that. And now all of our executive committee, our president, vice president, treasurer, and secretary are all women. It was so 5 years ago it was the other way around, and so that was definitely a thing we wanted to do. And so now we're working on other measures of diversity right now. But I think there weren't enough perspectives, and there weren't enough people to do all the work. Was really what the problem was.
Okay.
And 9 is a good number, but we're also wanting to have, we have more work to do, and we need some more people, and we need some younger people. You know, we're thinking succession of board and succession of staff and volunteers. And if we wake up one day and we have all board members who are over 65 and starting to retire, we're kind of screwed. So we don't want to be in that position.
Okay.
I don't think anybody does, but
Yeah,
but
thanks.
we had an all station meeting about 4 years ago where and we took the whole group, the family photo in front of the Christmas tree, and everyone but there were probably 40 people there, and 2 of them didn't have gray hair. And that was like pretty huge wake up call. Love people with gray hair, have a few myself, but that wasn't the only wake up call, but it was one that was really captured in that photo. And in the last 3 years, we've gone from 6 programmers under the age of 35 to 12. And on the board, we went from no board members under 40 to having 2, and hopefully now 4 coming up soon. That took a lot of work to do, but your question was about numbers. And yeah, I think 9 to 13 for us is the sweet spot.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's try Sharon again. Don't hear anything. Okay, well, you can type it in the chat if you want.
Type it in the chat.
This is kind of related to the other question. Is there a limit to the number of programmers allowed on the board? You said 9 to 12 was your sweet spot, but do you?
Yeah, we don't have in policy a limit to the number of programmers who can be on the board. It's really up to the board president and executive committee to to take care of that, and also to vet someone. If someone's a real pain in the neck as a programmer, they're probably going to be a pain in the neck as a board member, even if they're a great programmer. So the board has to have, it's more self-discipline as opposed to a policy discipline to keep people coming onto the board who think because they're programmers, they get to run everything. So, yeah.
That's a good point. We had a question from Joseph. Do you have a mandatory board orientation with an outline of board roles?
Yes, we have. We're actually in the process, or I'm working with the president in the process of gearing up to do that again. We're going through every policy the station has to do a refresher, a review of all of them, and after that, with the onboarding materials for board members will come up. And we've got a little handbook. It used to be, we had a board president who used to be a consultant, and we had a 3-ring binder that was about like 80 pages thick for new board members. And now it's down to about 5 pages and a lot of conversation. One of the things we don't do that I've heard to be very successful is when a new board member comes, you buddy them up with somebody else who can, go out to coffee, have a couple talks or whatever about how things work on the board, not from the executive director or the president's viewpoint, but from a rank and file board member's viewpoint. I think that's something that we're probably going to start doing. But we have a board member contract confidentiality agreement, conflict of interest agreement. And I'd like to, when we redo this package, have one that's a personnel confidentiality agreement, so that whenever you go into executive session to talk about any personnel issue that's happening,
that's good.
board members have signed a thing saying, they don't just have to hear from the president, this is confidential. They've signed an agreement to that. And we have board members sign their general board member agreement when they first join.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that suite of documents happen every year. We have our programmers agree to consent to a programmer agreement every year. And I think, just my opinion, and I'll pitch it to our board president, is the board members should do that too. I'm a board president of another organization, so I kind of get this from two angles, I guess.
Matt, do you try as the manager to also have coffee with new board members?
Yes. Yeah, actually ahead of time and then after too. Yeah, try to have, yes. The answer is yes.
Bear, I see you had a question. Why don't you state your question so you can be more specific, and then we'll go to Marie after that. I think you're muted. You're muted, Bear.
Very muted.
Bear, you're muted.
Hitting the thing.
There you go.
There we go. No, this is called the push the buttons until they finally work. So thanks for this, Matt. I was wondering whether WERU has always selected board members this way. KMUD has elections, and I'm always, going back and forth about whether I guess this would call it a self-selecting board.
Yeah, self-selecting board. And I came on the scene 3 or 4 years into the station's life, so I'm not positive about what happened before my time, but I'm pretty sure it was self-selecting from the beginning. The station was originally going to be a religious station, and the board was all clergy, and they were all self-selected, and I think that just continued in the bylaws. When the bylaws changed from being a religious broadcaster to a community type of organization, different type of organization, I think self-selecting has been in the bylaws since the beginning.
And do you try and seat like a whole clump of board members at the same time, or is it like?
No, I think it would be nice to have them in sort of classes, but we haven't been able to really do that. So we have, they're kind of catch as catch can. When we have a spot open and we say, oh, we need someone who has these, we have a president keeps a matrix of skills and qualities and whatnot that we sort of use. And it's a good thing to have. And you say, wow, we need someone with, who's been, worked finance, nonprofit finance. We just added a new board member who just retired from doing that for another nonprofit. Well, that was on our radar. And so we were able to bring that person on, but not as a group. We haven't been doing it. No.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Nice to see you.
Yeah. Good to see you. That's what was muted. Every time I was saying, great to see you, you couldn't hear me. Okay.
Thank you, Bear.
Thank you.
Marie.
I had a couple of comments. There are some stations that feel there's a conflict of interest if you have producers as board members. And I'm wondering how that has worked out for you. And secondly, you were talking about board members understanding that everything is confidential and they don't have to be told by anyone. Are your board meetings then open to anybody at the station who wants to sit in?
So the answer to that one is yes. Anyone, member of the public, and any volunteer can come to a board meeting. We have the first 15 minutes of the board meeting is open for public or volunteer comments. And then when the board goes into its business, the guests are asked to listen in, but every conversation the board has, if you go to the meeting, you're not part of that conversation. A board member can invite you into the conversation, or the board president, rather, as facilitating, can invite you in, but it's mostly for public observation.
Yeah.
And
it's
then
the same. Okay.
Same for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Plus, if we have a personnel issue or something that is private, we ask, we hold that to the end, and then ask those who are just attending that it's a closed session.
Right. And your question about the conflict of interest about programmers being on the board, I've heard it both ways. I've heard, you don't want programmers on the board of directors because the board of directors is more to represent the community of listeners as opposed to the smaller community of programmers. I've heard it other ways at other stations that you have to have some programmers on your board because they know the inner workings and you need that perspective. On our board, it's a combination of the two. Right now we have, out of the 9, we have 3 programmers. We had 4, but one of them just stopped being a programmer and is just a board member. And when we add 2, we're going to add 1 is a programmer and 1 is not. So it goes anywhere. I think the most we've ever had is half of them being programmers, and we really haven't had any big problems with that arrangement. I think, again, it goes into being really careful, the vetting process of making sure that someone you bring onto the board has been carefully vetted and is not just, well, they're a nice person and a great DJ, let's get them on the board. I mean, everyone's probably experienced, or maybe, hopefully everyone hasn't, but a lot of people have, where organizations where board members are recruited because they're nice people. And that's about their main qualification, which is very cool that they're nice people, but they need other things. You need other things other than just a group of nice people hanging out. Do you guys say if they're anyone to recuse themselves? And I'm thinking of a producer where you might be voting on something that would affect that producer, and ask that producer to not vote. Yeah, I don't recall us ever doing that, but I think if something came before the board that really did impact them, we certainly would. Policy, like programming policy, is not the purview of the board. So if our volunteer, our programmer handbooks aren't, the board gets shown them periodically, and I do Q&A with them periodically, but they don't write the policies. If there's something in there that disturbs them or they think is missing or whatever, they can send me off on a task to remedy that. But the board doesn't write all the programming policies, so that conflict is possible, but not a common thing. Then is it your program and operations manager who writes up policies? It's a team of staff with help from the chair of the program advisory committee, who is a board member. So it's myself as general manager, our public affairs manager, and our program and ops manager. We all work together. Somebody will take the lead and the others vet, so it's a collective thing. And we have the board member who's the chair of the programming committee is kind of the transparency. And we'll share this with the programming committee as well in draft form when we're changing policies. So yeah, good question.
Davine, did you feel like your question was answered about conflict of interest, or do you want more specific examples?
Yeah, I understand the conflict of interest question about a producer also being on the board, but Do you have examples of other conflict of interest situations?
Yeah, we had one years ago, and it didn't. It wasn't a bad thing, but one of our board members was an IT professional, and said, "Hey, this was when we first had a website," and said, "Hey, I can build a website for the station, and save the station some money." And so we looked around, and sure enough, this guy can build websites, and it cost us half as much as the going rate. So he was hired, but he had to, in our conflict of interest policy, you have to, at the beginning of the year, declare any conflict of interest that you have. So he was getting paid by the organization as a board member. And as long as that conflict is known by the rest of the board, and that at that point, it wasn't a bad conflict. He filled out the form, everyone knew, and everyone was cool with it. Another would be if a family member has a construction business and the organization wants to hire this company to do renovations to the building. That all has to be on the up and up. And the board may say, you know what, we don't want to, it's, sometimes they say, don't hire the plumber next door to fix your sink. If something goes wrong, you have to deal with your neighbor, not the plumber. So that's a reason why I've heard in some cases, and I don't know if we've ever done that, but to say no to a relative's, employing a relative of someone on the board as a contractor. I think that's the most common thing in nonprofits, is when there's a relative of a board member who has a business that wants to interact with the organization.
Sharon asks, what happens when you need to tell a prospective board member no? How do you do that delicately so you don't lose an important friend and supporter?
Oh, what a great question. I think that it depends on the person who is whether it's ultimately it's the board president's responsibility, I'd say, if someone is approaching the pipeline of getting on the board and the board doesn't think they're the right person. I think it's the board president's responsibility as the leader of the board to break the news to that person. And we've had board members who have finished their terms and want to come back on, and we had somebody else in mind to fill that role, and they've done their time, and the board president had that conversation with this person to say, hey, we want you to stay doing this and this and this, but we're also wanting to bring in some new folks to get diversity in our leadership. And you'd been on the board for 9 years, and let's have somebody else. And they worked it out, and it was not a contentious thing. If somebody is really not appropriate for the board, we probably try to head them off at the pass before they got too far into the process. And one of the great ways of doing that is true, but it could be used as a white lie, is there's people in front of you in line. We've had a couple people, one person say, hey, I'd like to explore being on your board. And we actually did have a couple people already in the pipeline. And so you can, you can use that, whether it's the truth or the other. It might be a white lie if you have other people in mind who may not be in the pipeline yet, but you have other people with other skills who you want to approach. And I think that's honest. But yeah, keeping a good friend is I guess at some point in time, all you can do is really be honest and gentle and kind to someone. And if they decide they don't want to be friends anymore, you've done your best.
Jackie, you have a question.
Yeah, real quick. And it's more of sort of a comment going back to that, who's on the board, programmers versus not. And again, I think I like the way you've set things up, because we've run into trouble. And like recently we were having a conversation because some of our programmers who got on the board, and we have very diverse programmers at the station. We want diversity. Yet many of these young, and they're usually younger people who are from diverse communities, think that when they're on the board, then they've got this power, and they are there to represent their community, but they've struggled to understand that sometimes you have to not think just of your community and the best for the station as a whole. We had many people resign in a huff recently, but what we realized is that at the same time, we can't really necessarily fill out our board, I think, with enough people if we don't leave it open to programmers. But I think the key, like you said, is upfront, very specific policies and procedures, expectations laid out, and the importance of like educating right from the start of, with your board orientation and that sort of thing. And that's what we're trying to move to, is like clear expectations and boundaries, so that if someone starts to go off the rails, they get pulled back in and saying, your behavior has to change, or else, you're just not going to work to be on the board of directors. Right. So that's been a challenge, but we're trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Good luck. Yeah, that's the responsibility of the board president to a large degree, is to, if anyone needs to be, reeled in, that's their job. And if an executive director is having micromanagement from a board member who thinks that because they're a board member, they can call with embark orders at the executive director whenever they want, that's for the executive director responsibility to go to the board president, and then the board president has to reel that person in. And that kind of jumps into that micromanaging topic. You want your executive director and general manager to delegate to staff and volunteers. The board has to delegate to the general manager, and that gets to be problematic when board members want to pick the color of the t-shirts, or the schedule of the folk show. That gets to be problematic.
We have a question from Joseph. As a public station, is the board/station registered with the state as a nonprofit business under the state nonprofit regulations?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, just like any other nonprofit in the state, we're registered.
Okay. Is the GM a voting member of your board? Did we cover that one?
No, I'm not ex officio. I get that fancy title though.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there anyone here who is where the licensee is not your radio station, but a parent organization? Okay.
For us, our organization does nothing but radio. So we are an independent entity.
So, Matt,
I have two questions. First is, do you have a formalized vetting process? Like, do you have a checklist that you go through when you vet somebody that is always the same?
That's a great idea. No, we don't. We probably thank you for the idea, Ursula. When we redo our recruiting package and process, that's going in there.
Okay, I'll send you what KHOI does. I don't know if it's very good, but they have something.
No, that's really good.
The second question is a little bit of a bigger question. You mentioned that you have right now a good relationship with the chair of the board as the manager.
Yes.
Can you talk about a good relationship between the manager and the chair of the board?
Yeah. In general terms, I think regular communication is important. That if you have a board president or conversely a general manager who don't talk, we talk once a week, and we don't get into super great detail on everything, but I, either email her or we talk on the phone about what's happening, about what's going on. So just regular communication, so that when when something hits the fan, you already have some good habits on how to communicate with each other. And so when something goes bad and you really need to work together as a team, you're already working well together on the regular stuff, and you're able to hopefully rise to the occasion and deal with something bigger, whether it's personnel, whether it's a rogue board member, whether it's a COVID issue at the station. So that communication in good times and bad. I think it's really important for the board president to respect the general manager and not to micromanage. You're sharing more with the president or chair than a lot more information on a regular basis than other board members get. That still doesn't mean that the board president can call you up and say, hey, you ought to take so-and-so off the air. I think their show sucks or whatever. So I think there has to be respect of those lines of authority. Board president doesn't manage staff. The executive director manages staff. And I think the board president has to be respectful of that. At the same time, the executive director or general manager shouldn't be going to board members to talk about things that should be talked to the president about. And if there's a problem with that communication, something needs to be worked out. If the board president is not accessible, that's a problem that has to be handled openly and honestly. And that, I imagine, can be pretty tough. I've been pretty lucky with board presidents here. And as a board president myself in another organization, I have a really great relationship with the executive director. Because we talk and we talk a lot. And I think another thing that's really important for the relationship, and this is kind of a sidebar, but strategic planning. If the board president and the executive director, general manager are leading the charge on some strategic planning, they're the keepers of that plan. They've got to be on the same page if they've all agreed on the plan, and let's carry out the plan working as a team. If there isn't a plan, then it can go in any direction. And so that's a vote in favor of strategic planning, because it makes the relationship more manageable between the chair and the GM.
KMUD has been dealing with a situation where volunteer programmers and listeners who they don't feel like their viewpoint on COVID has been represented. And they've taken to writing to the board about the problems that they're seeing with KMUD programming. Has WERU had to deal with things like that? I mean, basically our board says, hey, this is a staff decision, this isn't a board decision, but we also have a programmer rep on the board who was on the programming selection and review committee before she was elected to the board and is still on that committee. I'm just wondering whether you have any situations like that where there's some weird crossovers.
No, nothing. Fortunately, nothing in terms of during the pandemic, in terms of COVID. When we put one thing that we had discussion of the board on that did affect programmers very directly was our protocols for the studio. Mm-hmm. And myself and ops manager, we put together a series of protocols, took them to the board for approval. And some board members wanted to talk about different ones and make some changes and things. And we negotiated what the policy was going to be. That wasn't about content, though.
Right.
Where our board gets into content is in a very, very general way and in a strategic planning way. So, for instance, they may say we want more programs that provide that make an effort at diversity in the community and getting some programs on that do that, or get younger, make an effort of doubling the number of under 30 programmers on the air. Those kind of general things. And then it's up to staff and volunteers to work out the specifics.
Bear, during the pandemic, or kind of towards the end of the first wave, Ollie Lightfoot did a roundtable here about a survey she did with the KVMR staff about how to reopen the station. And it was really interesting. And we kind of, at KHOI, we kind of used that as a template for doing that, so that we did a survey. Now, it was interesting. I mean, she said nothing on the survey, none of the options on the survey was anything the staff would not do. So they did limit the survey to what they were willing to do. But there were a lot of options. And we did that at KHOI, and it was a good tool for kind of getting everybody's buy-in on how to proceed. And that roundtable is should be on our website.
I'll double check.
And also, if you want a copy of the survey we did at KHOI, I can send it. But it was really useful because people kind of couldn't argue with it afterwards, because we did follow what the majority of the people wanted to do.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I'll take anything you got.
Davine.
So would bylaws for WERU would you be willing to share that so we could compare your
sure.
bylaws?
Yeah,
and anybody else who wants to share their bylaws too, so we can
we just did a review and an update of our bylaws just a couple months ago, so they're in pretty good shape, I think.
So it's to everybody. Okay. Let's see. Anyone else got any questions? I'm going to double check on that roundtable. Some of them I deleted because they were personal, but I'll go back and make sure. I'll take a double check for that, the one about the survey.
My question is, does my mic work yet?
Yes.
Yay! All right. Brought my technical director in. We got it all sorted out. Thank you. This has been great, Matt. Thank you so much. Sorry I wasn't able to input more, but it's really useful, especially to have a station that's been doing this a little while. Hear how you guys have kept it going. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Matt, do you see any on the board? Is there any tension between, I mean, there's an issue of leadership in any organization, which has a big effect on how people make decisions. Do you find, how do you negotiate that between the manager and the chair of the board, that the issue of who is the leader, so to speak, in terms of decision making for the board?
I guess I'd say that it depends on what kind of decision, like what the topic is. That I don't know though. I mean, the way we're working now is that since I keep our president informed, our chair informed, and she keeps me informed of what she's up to. Like, she's working on reviewing all the policies of the station, and I'm sort of helping her with that. But I'm not in charge of that. So she's taking the leadership on that, or on the bylaws, she took the leadership on that. As far for the overall organization, I think she's not a programmer. She's not really known outside of the organization as, and she recently moved away from the core of the station, and Zoom is really great for her staying on the board as the president. But I think people identify me just because she's been around as long as me, but in the background. So I think the board certainly regards her as the leader of the board and holds her in high esteem. I think that probably more people in the public regard me as the leader because they know of me. Anyways, I'm on the air sometimes. I've been around for 25 years. And she's been behind the scenes for 25 years. So internally, though, volunteers and the board itself know her as, hold her in high esteem. But she's not a micromanager, so most programmers haven't really had to encounter her as someone involved with their stuff.
It sounds like you've worked out some way to share the leadership position.
Yeah, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, congratulations.
What's that?
That's hard to do.
Yeah, thank you. It's taken a lot of practice, but I've been fortunate to have good people to do that, and most everyone has been kind of deferred public leadership in a way that I'm the spokesperson unless I ask them to get involved with something, and that's worked out pretty well. And where I'm a board president, I do the same thing. I'm asked to write the fundraising letter, and in the program guide, I'm asked to write an annual letter on how swell things are. And but in terms of operations, I'm just kept in the loop, and when I can help, I help. And when I need to marshal the forces of the board and get the board to do something, I'm asked by the executive director, and I rattle the cage of the board to get things done. And but I don't want to make it sound like it's all perfect and easy. It's if you're having challenges on your board, yeah, everyone's been there in some way or another before. So it's kind of like when you get in that sweet spot with your board, really enjoy it, because it's not always there, but it's a culture thing. And if you can get board members, at least a core of them, who have this respect this culture of lines of authority and policy and all that, I think you're way better off than if there's people coming on the board who want to don't want to respect that culture and don't want to respect the policies. But the culture, policies, culture runs over policies all the time. And so you have to have policies as part of the culture. You can't have a policy that says what the culture is going to be. You have to have the respecting policies as part of the culture. And that's we work really hard. We have worked really hard on that, and it hasn't always been that way.
Murray.
We're doing everything by Zoom, and I'm going to be sending out our FCC regulation summary for signature by all of our producers and all of their team members. And I was thinking about asking them to sign it and just send me a picture of their signature on their page. I was wondering, with contracts and so forth right now, what is everybody else doing? Or maybe you're not on lockout like we are.
No, well, for just speaking for WERU, we our annual programmer agreement, we sent it out to everyone, and we said it was okay if you just send an email saying I sign electronically, and we just saved all those emails instead of having people actually sign them. Signing it and taking a picture, though, that's a great idea. We did that with vaccination cards, and so maybe this year we'll do that with volunteer agreements. I learned something good.
You require vaccination?
Yes, or if we can make a comment, if we could, the policy requires that, or we do grant exemptions for if there's a medical or religious reason that the person makes a good presentation on.
I was going to respond quickly to Marie's question.
Yeah.
I did used that legally, where we had a legal document and we had people take a picture of their signature on it, and that worked. But I also wanted to just recommend, we use a thing called Cognito. It's an online platform. And it's $12 a month for their basic service. I don't have I don't get any kickback or anything. It's just been useful to us. And people can actually, use their mouse and sign the document that way. You might want to consult with your lawyer about how, how that will hold up in any law situation if necessary. But it works for our purposes and for programmer agreements, great. And it also allows you to upload documents, where we're now having people upload their vaccination cards or negative tests. So just want to chime in.
Cool, thanks, Sharon. Yeah,
that question of having volunteer programmers sign an agreement, in our mind, it's basically to refresh, it's a two-sided page that is a synopsis of the main policies, or the biggest, most important policies from our 15-page programmer handbook. And it kind of reaffirms every year, but it's not like in the contract doesn't say that you're going to get to have a show if you do all these things. I mean, nobody has, here we look at it, it's a privilege to be on the air. And so it's not a contract between the person and the organization to say, if you do these things, you get to have a show. One of the things in there is I understand that violation of this policy may result in losing my show, or, so it's and it also has something about you can lose a show if for, any number of reasons. So.
Okay, let's see. Anything else?
I have a question if nobody else does.
Yeah.
Matt, I can't remember, did you, in your initial outline, did you say how the board deals with grievances?
No, I didn't. We have a grievance policy that is in the process of getting revised. But basically, are you talking about a grievance? What kind of grievance would you have in mind? A programming one, or?
There are many ways, right?
Right.
I mean, okay, so if a volunteer or a programmer has a grievance, does the board hear that? And
no.
Then again, no. So who hears it?
It goes from the staff to the general manager to the programming committee, and the programming committee gets to make an advisory vote, not the final say. If someone doesn't like the whole process going along, they can go to a board meeting and state their case, but the board doesn't vote on this. It's basically it comes down to the general manager.
But if the grievance is against the manager,
right? If the grievance if it's a programming grievance against the manager, that's yeah, I don't know. The last time we had that was when we took someone off the air for egregious behavior, and they went to the programming committee to complain and wanted to go to the board. And the board said, don't come to us. And the programming committee voted unanimously to be in support of what the general manager did, taking this person off the air. I think if, yeah, that's why this process needs to be revamped, but that's how it is now. It needs some fine tuning. In terms of our workplace harassment policy, we've got a strong policy for that as well. And that's a whole,
right, that's a legal thing. Yeah,
that's a whole other ball of wax. Yeah.
What if there's a grievance among the board members? What happens?
We don't have any policy around that. We do say that someone can be, that in the bylaws it has how someone can be removed from the board by the rest of the board members, but I don't think we have something if a board member is aggrieved, towards another board member.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Did you have a response, Bear? It looked like you were waving your hand.
Yeah, KMUD actually has a grievance panel, that's made up of community members that aren't involved at the station. And usually the way it works is we try to encourage people to resolve their issues through the mediation committee. It used to be a personnel committee, but then it got evolved into mediation. But they aren't required to do that first. If they, if they're absolutely adamant that they want to have a judgment come down where you're right or you're wrong, as opposed to trying to resolve and hear each other, then it goes to this panel. And I think has it existed for about 10 years now? Maybe they've actually heard like three or four grievances actually make it to them. Those things get resolved.
Who's on this mediation panel? Are they?
Mediation is made up. The board appoints 3 people, and 2 were elected by programmers and volunteers at the station. And the programmer volunteers that are elected serve for 3 years. The others are appointed yearly by the board. And usually there's no term limits, and usually the same people will sign up to be appointed a lot of times. And a lot of them have had mediation training. And the grievance panel, that's probably the easiest one for us to fill, because people go, wow, I feel like I'm volunteering for KMUD and I don't have to do anything. I mean, I've been on this panel for 3 years and I've only had one thing happen. So, it's a lot easier for us to find those folks than to find board members, which is a lot more challenging.
Well, thank you, Bear.
Yeah, thanks, Bear. That's interesting.
That question of a grievance policy, though, is a really good one. And as I said, we're in the process of looking at all of our policies, and that's one that I want to, get a little more clarity in. But ultimately, if a volunteer has their show taken off the air and they don't like that the programming committee voted in support of the program director and general manager, they could go to a board meeting and have that first 15 minutes to talk as much as they want. And I suppose a board member, the board president, a board member could approach the president and lobby me, I suppose. But no board member, individual board member is my boss. The board as a whole is. So I wouldn't turn this off. I wouldn't expect to be overruled by the board, but it's possible to get, kind of lobbied by the board. Hey, have you considered this? And that would be fine. But having the board say we're voting to put someone back on the air, I would have a big problem with that.
Any other questions?
Thank you all for your great questions and your attentiveness. This is good practice for me, talking to people that aren't on the radio, that I can actually see.
Well, thank you, Matt. This was a wonderful discussion. It was just a lot of information. Very awesome.
Oh, thank you. And I'm sure that everyone has their experience like that. Anyone could do this presentation and we'd all learn from it. So if anyone else has a different story or a different way of doing it, I'd come to your presentation. Yeah.
I think this would always be a good one to revisit throughout the year.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to share, let us know. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt. You're a great role model. You've always been a role model for me, so I really appreciate it.
Well, back at you.
Well, and thank you everyone for coming today, and it was good to see everybody, and thanks for participating, and we will see you again soon.
All right, take care,
Thanks
everyone.
so much, Matt. That was great.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Good to see you.
Good to see everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.